Hello and welcome to the Chayrion podcast, your guide to everything concerning the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond.
I would like to welcome my colleague, Professor Erzsébet N. Rózsa, a university professor, and my name is László Csicsmann, university professor too. And this podcast is about the recent development in the Gaza Strip. It's almost 3 months past since the beginning of the October conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And definitely my first question is a more general question about the prospects of a longer-term ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. How do you see this?
I would like to start with one very slight modification, as we both of us know it very well, that this series of events which started with the terrorist attack by Hamas on October the 7th, 23. This was a new wave in a long series of struggles, fights and wars between the Palestinians and the Israelis. As you asked me about the day after the ceasefire, it is a very, very difficult question because on the one hand, although there are many countries, they are usually state actors who try to mediate between the Hamas and Israel. At the moment, we do not see that a new phase of ceasefire would set in soon. Obviously, it will be a must sooner or later, but so far there has been 7 days of ceasefire, and since then the fighting is going on. Ceasefire negotiations are going on and halting and stopping and started again and secretly and openly and in all possible ways. But at the moment, we do not see that promptly a ceasefire would set in.
Yeah, I have two interconnected questions. One definitely is about the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. How do you see this problem?
Usually, since the first days, so October 7th was a shock, a catastrophe, a tragedy for everyone. Practically everyone was shocked and everyone was also surprised. It was not expected. But very soon, the tragedy of the Israeli victims and also the hostages, we shouldn't forget that there were 240 hostages taken by the Hamas, and not only Hamas, but other Islamist organizations in the Gaza Strip, namely the Islamic Jihad. Very soon, the tide turned, the attention turned toward the humanitarian situation. And the reason is that the Gaza Strip, on the one hand, is a very, very small territory. It is 41 kilometers long, 6 to 10 kilometers wide. So practically, if we compare it to the territory of Budapest, for example, it would be 2/3 of the whole territory of Budapest. If we compare it to a smaller city like Cluj in Romania, it is about 1.5 the territory of Cluj. So it is a small territory which is populated by a huge number of people, more than 2 million, 2.2, 2.3 million people. And why the humanitarian situation is even worse than anywhere globally can be imagined is that these people are closed in to this strip. They cannot leave. They cannot go out of the territory. So humanitarian issues started first with water, electricity. Imagine that the Gaza Strip has very, very little water in itself. So most of the water was coming from Israel. Electricity was coming from Israel. Anything else was coming from Israel. And Israel, in its self-defense, straight at once stopped and closed these ties. So it meant that there is no water, there is no electricity. Imagine when hospitals have to operate without electricity at all. without fuel, and it is winter even there. And then the lack of food, the lack of medicines, and so on. The situation has become very grave since then, in spite of the fact that on the basis of some negotiations, some limited amount of humanitarian aid is going into the Gaza Strip every day. But this is far from enough. And the biggest fear now, and the alarm bells are ringing very loudly in the different international healthcare institutions and societies like the WHO and the other UN organizations, that the danger, the threat of epidemic diseases is rising so high that in a few weeks' time, not even months, in a few weeks' time, approximately 25-30% of these 2-point-something million people may die in an epidemic. So this will be an epidemic center. And since practically no one can leave if there is not a settled, negotiated ceasefire, release, and so on situation, then there is a very grave danger that there will be a lot of victims.
Yeah, that's a very serious situation there. But I have a more sensitive question, especially some Israeli politicians recently said that the goal of Israel is to expose the Gaza population from the Gaza Strip to other countries. I saw something in the news about Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, as an opportunity. So, of course, not all the Israeli society shares these ideas, but definitely that kind of things are in the Israeli media as well, and especially previous members of still members of this emergency government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, right-wing politicians. I mean, they have their idea to forcibly expose the population from the Gaza Strip as the solution, lasting solution for this conflict. What do you think about that?
I think that, first of all, the proposal is based on a false assumption. As for decades now, the international community, including all the Arab countries, was thinking that regional stability in the Middle East can be reached without solving the Palestinian issue. Now, the false presumption is that if the Gaza issue, the Gaza Strip issue will be settled in a way that will solve the Palestinian issue. This is not so. Here I have to remind you all that in the Gaza Strip, as mentioned, there are 2.2 million Palestinians living, but in the West Bank there are 3.5 million other Palestinians. In East Jerusalem, their number is still coming close to 1 million. So the Palestinian issue will not disappear, will not be solved, even if these Israeli proposals, which, as you rightly said, are not shared by the whole of the Israeli society. What I find a little bit, how should I say, interesting, that Israeli politicians are proposing Congo as a possible place where the Palestinians could go and settle down there. Why I find this interesting? Because if we remember back to the times before the proclamation of the State of Israel in 1948, so in the 1930s, 1940s, the British mandatory power who were controlling the mandatory territory of Palestine offered the incoming Jewish population the territory of Rwanda, where they could settle down and live in peace and have their own Jewish state, to avoid the clashes between the local Arab Palestinian population and the incoming Jewish citizens. And now again, Central Africa, or maybe it was Uganda, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But now, again, Central Africa is put forward. Although coming back to the politicians' solution, and also some part of the Israeli society, namely the conservative Jewish settlers, some groups of the conservative Jewish settlers are already planning to come to the Gaza Strip and yet again establish Jewish settlements there. But the thing is that the Palestinian population who, as I said, are closed in without the opportunity to live at all in this little territory, these Palestinians, most of them are on the one hand refugees. There are families which have been expelled from their homes and fields already twice in 1948-49 and then in 1967. So the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip are in many cases the refugees already who do not want to leave this territory. And by the way, this is the main argumentation by neighboring Egypt and neighboring Jordan when the leading politicians, the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah Sisi or Abdullah, King of Jordan, who say that we will not assist in yet again expelling the Palestinian population from their homes. But as you said, it is only part of the Israeli politicians, although they are very vocal, and sometimes their expressions are very, very rude, expressions that remind us sometimes of the between the two world wars European Jewish situation. So it is very, very strong, very harsh, and no wonder that even the Israeli government is acting more cautiously on this issue.
Yeah, thanks for very interesting answers. And let me ask you a bit about the Israeli society. And the question, one of the most important issue for the Israeli society, which you already mentioned, the hostage crisis. Still approximately more than 120 hostages taken by Hamas and the Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. And it seems there are not much news about them at this moment. So, and this is one of the most important issue for the Israeli society. If there is no ceasefire, what do you think about their future and how do you see the prospect of the hostage issue?
Well, from the point of the hostages, we had the impression, and the Israeli society, first of all, had the impression that the Israeli government was acting a little bit too slow. Because when the Israeli government started the retaliation for the terrorist attack, which it did in its own self-defense, in the first couple of days, we did not hear much about the hostages, about the release of hostages. And practically from the first moment on, there was a huge movement in part of the Israeli society, started mostly by the families of the hostages, that the first issue should be the safe release of hostages. By now, approximately half of the hostages have been released by Hamas, and there was a deal of an exchange of hostages for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, among them also many women and children. But then, after the first, I think there were 3 instances. First, it started with 2 elderly ladies, and then there were like 2 bigger number of people. Somehow the situation has stopped. And the families obviously do not understand why. In the end, after a few days or maybe even weeks, they could get access to Prime Minister Netanyahu, they could meet him, they could try to press him, but it seems that somehow the issue was stuck. And there are different explanations. First of all, no one knows if the hostages are still alive.
Yeah.
Most probably, the assumption is that many of them are alive, hidden somewhere. But since the territory is so densely populated, it would be very difficult to save their lives when there are military attacks and bombardments. No one knows. The Israeli defense forces that went into the Gaza Strip in land operations, they tried to avoid places where they thought, where they had reasons to think that there are hostages held, so that to spare the life of hostages. But in fact, we don't really know. And time and again, it turns out about 1, 2, 3 persons that they are already dead. But the lists and the name lists are, I think, not open to the public, and I think this is also right because of the safe operations. So this is one thing. The other thing is that it seems that whenever one party in the conflict, either Israel or Hamas, makes a proposal that in return for releasing the hostages, we demand ceasefire, and so on, they are never in accord with each other. So when one side wants to offer ceasefire or release of some prisoners from prisons from Israel in return for the hostages, then Hamas is not ready to take the deal, and vice versa. But also, as you mentioned, and I think I also mentioned, it is even more complicated because it seems, and it is also not clear because we don't have any real information about it, that some of the hostages are not held by the Hamas, but by the Islamic Jihad, which presupposes that in the original terrorist attack and taking hostages, they coordinated and both were there present. It is not clear at all. But this is also the situation. The two mediating countries that seem to be the most active and that seem so far to be the most successful are Qatar and neighboring Egypt.
And why Qatar? It's very interesting to see a country without any diplomatic relations with Israel mediating in a conflict.
Well, Qatar, as other Arab states in the Persian Gulf, on and off did have relations with Israel. Not official, not publicly acknowledged, not diplomatic, but at least the trade section, it was called in Doha. I remember the Qatar case. In Doha, it was called a trade section, but from the Israeli side, the head of the trade section was called an ambassador. So there were and there have been contacts. Qatar, because Qatar is practically the only state actor these days and these years, should I say, which has operating, working relations and contacts to both Hamas and this way also to Israel. Hamas has an office in Qatar, and some of the leaders of the political wing of Hamas are continuously living in Qatar. So frankly speaking, in order to negotiate or mediate a ceasefire or a hostage exchange deal, you need to talk. There must be some talk between the parties. And since the parties cannot talk directly to each other, they need a mediator. And in the moment, Qatar is the only possible mediator.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm very interested in your opinion that very recently there were some contradictory news from Israel. A few days ago, Netanyahu, the prime minister, told that this military operation would last 4 months in 2024. But on the other hand, it was also announced that Israel is going to withdraw some of the troops from the Gaza Strip. How would you evaluate these contradictory news?
The withdrawal news came, I think, 2 days ago, and ever since then everyone is trying to find out what the reason is. But if I am correct, at least the explanation that I have read was that withdrawing some troops in order to be able to make less damage for the civilian society, because Israel also...
In Israel.
In the Gaza Strip, Israel has also come to realize that these already now 3 months long bombardment, the total disruption of life in the Gaza Strip has turned and is turning such segments of global public against them, which before used to support Israel and Israel's just answer to the terrorist attacks of Hamas. But now, by the day, the number of the public globally is saying that enough is enough. This is disproportionate. This is a joint punishment of the whole of the Palestinians. So I think that this is also part of the reason. And there is also another interesting phenomena that is taking place practically at the same time, namely one of the US warships has been withdrawn also, because the listeners may remember that the United States sent 2 American warships to the shores of the Gaza Strip and Israel, just to make sure that conflict will not escalate. But now one of the ships has been withdrawn, and also these troops have been withdrawn. It is not yet clear that the withdrawal of these troops means that there was one other explanation, and that was economic.
Exactly.
And maybe you will explain it in another part of our...
Israeli economy should be revived in a way.
Israeli economy should be revived, because we shouldn't forget that the troops, many people are conscripted and they were called in, are reserve forces, and they were called in to fight. Now, it is already 3 months they are taking part in these fights, which means that for 3 months they are not working in their proper working places. So the Israeli economy pays a very, very, very huge price for this military operation in Gaza.
Yeah, thank you. And the very last question, we always paying attention on the Gaza Strip, which is correct, but we have the West Bank escalation, I would say, as well. How do you see the situation at this moment in the West Bank?
Well, I think the West Bank, but we can also include Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, of course, it's part of the story.
Jerusalem, maybe I will start with Jerusalem, and it is about East Jerusalem. But we also should not forget that, especially with the very last, before the unity, the last Israeli government, the conservative layers and groups of the Israeli society, and especially the settlers, got practically an absolutely free and unlimited hand, which resulted in not only atrocities against Palestinian Muslim Palestinians, but also against Christians and Armenians. The Armenian bishop in Jerusalem has been complaining that they were attacked, their churches were desecrated, their people were attacked in the street and in the churches as well. So it is not only for the Muslims, directed not only at the Muslims, but also at the Christians. These atrocities were even more severe in the West Bank. They're obviously against the Muslim Palestinian population. The listeners should think of the West Bank as a territory which is very, very small pieces of land, sometimes some houses, fenced off, walled around. The connecting roads are also fenced along all around. Some roads can only be used by the Jews, some can only be used by the Arabs. It looks like a Emmentaler cheese, practically. So it is not one continuous territory. And in the West Bank, frankly speaking, this series of events, the October 7 terrorist attack, was also, or could be attributed also, to the beginning of atrocities in the West Bank, when Jewish settlers in the West Bank in 1 month killed more than 100 Palestinians. And we haven't heard about it. No wonder that the Israeli military forces were not close to the Gaza Strip, but they were all ordered to the West Bank and to the ceasefire lines of the West Banks and to Lebanon, because the attacks or the escalation was expected from there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate all of your explanation. Unfortunately, we cannot solve the problem, especially the short term. Seems that military conflict still remains with us. But thank you and goodbye and thanks for listening us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Hairion podcast. We are looking forward to sharing with you more exciting news on the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. For further information, please follow us at hairion.com as well as on X and LinkedIn.